There is a moment, and every pilot who has flown long enough knows exactly what I'm talking about, when you look out the cockpit window and forget, just for an instant, that you are working. You forget the checklists, forget the flight plan, forget the altitude and the fuel. You simply stop and look. It was an October night, many years ago. I was crossing Chinese territory on a flight from Moscow to Hong Kong at 40,000 feet, with the sun long gone below the western horizon. I remember the sky as if it were yesterday, a band of deep violet dissolving into absolute black above, and below us, as far as the eye could reach, a sea of light. It was not like flying over any other place in the world. It was not like Paris with its avenues lit in gold. It was not like New York with its perfect grid glowing like an electronic circuit. This was something else. It was immense. It was continuous. It was as if someone had poured stars onto the earth and they had stayed there, pulsing, breathing, alive. My first officer at the time, a young man named Marcos from Rio de Janeiro, who is today a captain on the same fleet I flew, turned to me and said, almost in a whisper, "Captain, what is that?" And I answered in the only honest way I could, "It's China, Marcos. It's China." I was 38 years old on that flight. I had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times. I had landed in Tokyo, in Dubai, in Johannesburg, in Los Angeles. I thought the world had little left to surprise me. I was wrong. In the years that followed, I returned to China countless times. I landed in Beijing under snowstorms that reduced visibility to nearly zero. I approached Shanghai on a summer evening with the Huangpu River the color of molten copper far below. I overflew Tibet with my heart in my throat, with mountains that seemed to want to reach my aircraft. And every single time, without exception, China gave me something new. This is what I want to share with you today. Not a travel guide, not a geographical report, but what you see, feel, and think when you are sitting in that left seat at more than 35,000 feet, and China opens beneath you like the greatest book the world has ever written. Welcome to Tales from the Sky. I am your captain, and today we are going to fly over China together. To understand China from the sky, you must first abandon every scale you know. China covers 9.6 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, you could fit all of Western Europe, all of Eastern Europe, plus Turkey and still have room to spare. It is the fourth largest country in the world by area, but when you are flying over it, it feels like the largest. This happens because China is not merely big, it is varied in a way that few countries on this planet manage to be. On a single flight from Urumqi in the far northwest to Shanghai on the eastern coast, a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers, you overfly sand deserts that rival the Sahara, mountains that rival the Alps, fertile plains stretching as far as the eye can see, and then, finally, the densely populated coastline where hundreds of millions of people live in, cities that never stop growing. When a pilot receives a routing across China, the first thing we do is open the map and plan the waypoints, the reference points along the route. In China, those points have names that sound like lines from an ancient poem, Lanzhou Xian, Chengdu, Guilin. Each one of them, when you look down as you pass over, tells a different story. Chinese airspace is, to say it with all the admiration it deserves, a living organism. China today has more than 230 commercial airports and is building dozens more. Air traffic has grown so rapidly over the past decades that the controllers in Beijing and Shanghai handle volumes that would rival any hub in the Western world. From the cockpit, you hear the world through the radio. Technical voices in aeronautical English, the universal language of the sky, but with that characteristic accent that reminds you at every moment exactly where you are. There is something else a pilot notices when they begin flying regularly over China. The darkness. Not the darkness of ignorance, far from it, but the literal darkness of the territory. While the eastern coast, from the Pearl River Delta all the way to Beijing, blazes like a continuous constellation at night, the interior of the country plunges into a deep and almost total darkness. The provinces of Qinghai, Gansu, Tibet, the deserts of Gobi and Taklamakan, the the high plateaus where the air is so thin that even our pressurization systems work harder. It is as if China had two faces, one turned toward the 22nd century, the other still staring into eternity. Let me talk about Shanghai for a moment, because Shanghai deserves a moment. When you are on approach to Pudong International Airport, the city's great airport, opened in 1999 on land that was literally marshland a century ago, you begin to see the city materialize on the horizon in a way that few places in the world can manage. It does not appear gradually. It erupts. First come the towers of Pudong, the Jinmao Tower with its pagoda-like silhouette, the Shanghai World Financial Center with its rectangular aperture at the top, and the Shanghai Tower, the second tallest building in the world, with its helical body rising like a sculpture made of glass and ambition. Then, on the other side of the Wangpu, appears the Bund, with its early 20th century European colonial buildings lined up like witnesses to another era. And beyond, spreading in every direction as far as the horizon allows, the city, 24 million people, tens of thousands of kilometers of streets, a web of metro lines that makes the New York system look modest. On clear days, before beginning our descent, I used to call the first officer over and say, "Look at that," because there is something about seeing Shanghai from above, whole, all at once, that reorganizes the mind. You understand, viscerally, that you are approaching something that defies categories. It is not a city in the conventional sense. It is a force. Beijing is different. Beijing is more solemn, more horizontal, more ancient in its energy, even surrounded by modernity. When you fly to Beijing, the capital international airport appears on a plain that was, for millennia, the gateway to the heart of the Middle Kingdom. From the air, before reaching the airport, on days when the haze allows, you can see the silhouette of the city's historic center, the Forbidden City, the Palace of the Emperors, with its enormous complex of golden and red rooftops ringed by a belt of hutongs, the ancient residential alleyways, and then modern asphalt spreading in every direction like water in a flood. But Beijing has another characteristic that pilots know well, the pollution. There are days when you begin your descent from 30,000 feet, and the city simply does not exist. There is a layer of grey air so thick that only when you are below 2,000 feet do the runway lights appear. The ATIS, the airport's automatic weather information service, reports to kilometers visibility, and you know it will be a precision-ills approach all the way to the end. There is nothing glamorous about that, but there is something deeply human, the evidence of the price. A civilization paid for growing so fast. And then there is Guangzhou, Chengdu, Chongqing, Shenzhen. Each of these cities has more inhabitants than all of Argentina. From above, they resemble one another, an ocean of concrete, glass and light, but each has its own soul, its own texture, its own particular rhythm that you begin to perceive after many passes. Chongqing, for example, is built at a confluence of mountain rivers, and when you are on final approach at night, the city seems to climb the hillsides in layers of light, as if the stars had decided to take up residence in the rocks. It is one of the most cinematic experiences I have ever had in a cockpit. It is the most populous city in China and perhaps in the world, depending on how you count its 32 million inhabitants. 32 million! I repeat it because the mind needs more than one attempt to process that number. There is a curious thing that happens to a pilot after many years of flying. You begin to think about time differently. Not in the meteorological sense, though that too, but in the philosophical sense. When you are at 40,000 feet, looking down, the present and the past seem to coexist with a disturbing naturalness. China has a continuous civilization of more than 5,000 years. That means that below me, as I cross the territory in a matter of hours, there are layers upon layers of history sediment in the very earth. Every plain I overfly was once a battlefield. Every river once fed an empire. Every hill once sheltered a temple. Chinese history, seen from above, has an almost geographical logic. The great dynasties rose and fell around to river axes. The Yellow River, the Huanghe in the north, the cradle of early Chinese civilization, and the Yangtze River, the Changjiang in the center and south, which was for millennia the economic backbone of the country. When you cross these rivers from the air, and the Yangtze in particular with its more than 6,000 kilometers of length, you are crossing more than water. You are crossing centuries. Flying over the Yellow River Valley on a winter afternoon, with snow covering the plains and the river partly frozen, I found myself thinking about the Neolithic farmers who planted there 7,000 years ago. People who had no idea that one day there would be flying machines, crossing the sky above their heads, and yet there I was, a product of a technology they could never have imagined, looking down and recognizing in the shape of the land something eternal. China was unified for the first time into 21 BC by Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the same one who ordered the construction of his famous terracotta army and who gave the country its name, through the Latin pronunciation of Qin. At that time, Europe was still fragmented into tribes and city-states. Rome was young and violent. What would become France, Germany, England was forest and fog. And China already had a centralized bureaucracy, a unified writing system, and a concept of statehood that would not reach the West for many centuries more. That historical weight is felt physically when you fly over China. There is a density in the air, and I acknowledge that is poetic rather than scientific, a sense that the land below carries more than land. It carries memory. It carries the weight of one of the longest and most complex human experiences ever to have occurred on this planet. Let me tell you something that most people don't know. The Great Wall of China is not visible to the naked eye from space. That myth was repeated for decades, but astronauts have confirmed that. Given its dimensions, wide as a road, but not much more, it disappears into the texture of the landscape. However, from a commercial aircraft in cruise, under the right conditions in certain stretches, you can indeed see it. And when that happens, it is one of those moments that lodges in the memory forever. The first time I saw the wall from the cockpit was on a September morning, flying from Shanghai to Beijing at about 36,000 feet. Exceptional conditions, dry air, perfect visibility. The sun low enough to cast long shadows that revealed the relief of the terrain. We were passing over the mountains northeast of Beijing, the Yanshan range, when my first officer pointed down and said, "Look there, Captain." And there it was, a line, a thin, dark, sinuous line, running along the ridges of the mountains as if the earth itself had a scar, climbing hills, descending valleys, bending in impossible curves to follow the contour of the terrain, winding toward the horizon until it vanished in the haze of distances. The Great Wall, in its total extent, adding all the segments built across the different dynasties, measures more than 21,000 kilometers. 21,000. It is not a single structure, but a series of walls built and rebuilt over 2,000 years, from the 7th century BC through the Ming dynasty in the 17th century. The most famous and best preserved stretch, the one that appears in photographs, was built primarily during the Ming dynasty between the 14th and 17th centuries. Thinking about that from above, as that line moved slowly back beneath the wings of my aircraft, I wondered how many men died building it. Estimates vary, but historians suggest that between 400,000 and 1 million workers perished during its construction over the centuries. Many were buried within the wall itself. It is a monument, yes, but it is also a tomb. And from the air, with that impossible perspective that only flight allows, both things coexist with a solemnity that takes your breath away. Further south, if you overfly the province of Shaanxi toward the city of Xi'an, the terrain changes again. Xi'an was the capital of more than 10 Chinese dynasties, including the Great Tang Dynasty, when it was called Chang'an, and was possibly the largest city in the world. It was the starting point of the Silk Road, that extraordinary trade network that connected China to Persia, to India, to the Arab world, and eventually to Rome. From the air, Xi'an today looks like a medium-sized modern city. It has about 13 million inhabitants, which in China qualifies as medium-sized. But in the city center, visible from above, there is something unusual: the walls. The medieval walls of Xi'an, built during the Ming dynasty, still stand intact, forming a perfect rectangle of 14 kilometers around the historic core. From the cockpit, you see them clearly. An elevated line, the color of clay, cutting through the modern urban fabric with the authority of something that has existed for 600 years and has no plans to leave. But China is not only cities and history. There is another country down there, a country of such absurd, excessive beauty that it seems painted by hand by someone who had never heard the word moderation. Tibet first, because Tibet deserves to be first. When you overfly the Tibetan Plateau, the largest and highest plateau on Earth, with an average altitude of 4,500 meters, you are flying over what geographers call the roof of the world. And from the cockpit, the designation makes complete sense. You are at 40,000 feet, which is already high enough for the curvature of the Earth to appear subtly on the horizon. And below you, the mountains stand at 4, 5, 6,000 meters. The space between you and them is smaller than the space between them and the sea. The Himalayas, seen from above, is an experience no photograph prepares you for. It is not a mountain range. It is a wall, a white, irregular, violent wall, running east to west for nearly 2,500 kilometers. The tallest peaks, Everest, Lhotse, Makalu, Cho Oyu, emerge above the cloud layer like islands in an infinite whiteness. There are days when you fly above the high clouds and the peaks rise out of them, like fingers pointing at the sky. It is unsettling. It is beautiful in a way that goes beyond the aesthetic and reaches the spiritual. I have flown several routes that pass near the Himalayas. On one of them, flying from Mumbai to Shanghai, we passed relatively close to Everest. My second officer that day was a young female pilot from Sao Paulo on her first flight to Asia. She was in absolute silence for nearly 10 minutes, staring at that wall of snow and rock. Then she said simply, "I didn't know the world had this." I laughed, but I understood exactly what she meant. Further north, where Tibet gives way to the autonomous region of Xinjiang, the landscape changes completely. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name in Turkish means, depending on the translation, you go in, you don't come out, is one of the largest sand deserts in the world. Flying over it, you see dunes extending in every direction, undulating like the sea in slow motion. The desert has a heat you feel even from the cockpit, where the temperature is held at a steady 20 degrees regardless of what happens outside. There is something about the Taklamakan that evokes solitude, but not sad solitude, majestic solitude, the kind that reminds you that the Earth existed for billions of years before us, and will exist for billions more after. In southern China, in Guangxi province, there is another geological miracle. The karst mountains, those limestone formations that rise from the plain like towers and needles, are so extraordinary that they influenced Chinese painting. For more than 1,000 years, artists of the Song dynasty in the 10th century painted those mountains in ink and watercolor with a precision that Westerners found fantastic, almost unreal. How could mountains shaped like that exist? Nearly vertical, covered in vegetation emerging from the mist of the Li River. They do exist. And from the air, passing over the Guilin region on a day of light rain, with low clouds embracing the limestone towers and the river winding between them the color of jade. You understand completely why Chinese art developed that particular language. It was not stylization. It was documentation. It was an artist trying to do justice to what his eyes actually saw. One of the things that fascinates me most about China, after so many passes, is that it never chose between the past and the future. It decided to have both at the same time, and from the air, that is visible in a way that is almost comical in its candor. In Shanghai, you land at Pudong, one of the most modern airports in the world, opened in 1999 on land that was, literally, rice paddies 30 years earlier, and as you taxi to the terminal, the modern city surrounds you on all sides. Glass towers, elevated expressways, the maglev, the magnetic levitation train that can carry passengers from the airport to the city center at 430 kilometers per hour. All of this configures an image of modernity so aggressive it resembles science fiction. And yet, 20 minutes by car from the modernized Bund, the Longtangs still exist. The narrow alleys between the old brick buildings of the colonial era, where elderly people play mahjong on the sidewalks early in the morning, where hanging laundry out the window is still a common practice, where bakeries that have existed for 80 years still sell the same mantu. They always have. Time did not pass through there in the same way. Or perhaps it did, but it was gentle about it. In Beijing, that tension is even more dramatic. The Forbidden City, the imperial palace built between 1406 and 1420 during the Ming Dynasty, with its 9,999 rooms, its imperial yellow roof tiles, its gardens and rituals from another world, sits literally at the geometric center of the modern city. To the north, Jingshan Park. To the south, Tiananmen Square and a great hall of the people. All around it, the skyscrapers of 21st century Beijing. From the air, on approach, you see this with surreal clarity, a core of yellow and red. The imperial palace rooftops, surrounded by the blue-grey of modern steel and glass, as if someone had preserved the jewel at the center while building a modern vault around it. And in a way, that is exactly what happened. Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province in the heart of China, offers another kind of contrast. It is a city of nearly 20 million people with a culture of leisure. That is almost unique in the country. The people of Chengdu are famous for their love of tea, mahjong and relaxation. There is a saying that in Shanghai people work to live, and in Chengdu people live for pleasure. From the cockpit, Chengdu looks no different from any other Chinese megacity. But when you land there and go for a coffee, you notice the rhythm is different. Less tense, more human, perhaps, more ancient in its wisdom. And then there is the remarkable case of Lijiang in Yunnan, an ancient town that has been partially preserved and today coexists with an explosive modern periphery. From the air, you see the contrast with almost surgical precision. The historic core with its narrow stone streets, its curved rooftops, its water channels that have run there since the 13th century, surrounded by a constellation of new neighborhoods that could be anywhere on the planet. After so many years flying over China, I have accumulated a mental archive of surprises that defy the expectations of anyone who has never been to the country. Let me share a few of them with you. The first, China has a single time zone. One time zone for a country that stretches nearly 5,200 kilometers from east to west. For comparison, the United States has 6. Russia has 11. China, with continental dimensions, has 1. This means that when it is 8 in the morning in Shanghai and the sun is rising in Kashgar, at the western edge of Xinjiang, it is also 8 in the morning, but the sun will not rise for another 2 hours. The inhabitants of Western China live in a permanent artificial jet lag, waking and sleeping according to the rhythms of the Beijing sun, which is not their sun. For us pilots, this has a curious implication when we calculate the EOBT. The estimated off-block time from any Chinese airport, the time zone is always the same, UTC-8. It doesn't matter whether we are in Urumqi or Shanghai. Always UTC-8. It is an administrative simplification that, from an operational standpoint, makes life easier, but that from a human standpoint creates one of the largest temporal anomalies on the planet. The second, China has more than 55 ethnic groups officially recognized by the government. The Han group, the Chinese that most of the world imagines when thinking of China, represents about 91% of the population, but the other 9% is distributed among Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongols, Zhuang, Mao, Yi, and dozens of other peoples with entirely distinct languages, traditions, architectures, and histories. From the air, this translates into an extraordinary diversity of built forms, the blue-domed mosques of Xinjiang, the Tibetan Lamaist Buddhist monasteries, the tower villages of the Mao in Guizhou, the circular earthen fortresses of the Hakka in Fujian, structures so peculiar that when aerial photographs of them appeared in the 1980s, American intelligence services believed, for a moment, that they were military installations. The third, the density of construction in China has no precedent in human history. Over the past 4 decades, China has built the equivalent of all the urban infrastructure of the United States, but in a third of the time. From the cockpit, this means that every time you overfly an area you visited 5 or 10 years ago, it may be unrecognizable. Cities that were dots on the map have become metropolises. Fields that were fields have become suburbs. There is a kinetic energy in the transformation of the Chinese territory that you feel even from above. It is like watching a living organism growing in fast forward. The fourth, China has the largest high-speed rail network in the world, more than 40,000 kilometers of track, for trains traveling at speeds above 300 kilometers per hour. From the air, these rail lines are visible, white concrete ribbons, perfectly straight across the plains and magnificently curved through mountain regions, cutting across the territory, with an engineering that is itself a form of art, in some stretches, especially on the viaducts, that cross valleys and rivers. The structures have an architectural elegance that, seen from above, resembles sculpture on a continental scale. The fifth, and perhaps the most striking for a pilot, China has the highest altitude airport in the world. Daocheng Yading Airport in Sichuan sits at 1,411 meters above sea level. For comparison, the base of Everest Base Camp is at 5,364 meters. Operating at that airport is a considerable technical challenge. The air is so thin that the engines perform very differently from normal. The runway must be significantly longer to compensate for reduced lift, and pilots require specific training. I never landed there myself, but colleagues who have described it as one of the most demanding and most magnetic experiences of their careers. There is a particular solitude to the cockpit that those who have never been there might not imagine. It is not a sad solitude, it is a clean solitude, and you are separated from the world by a wall of tempered glass and several kilometers of air. And in that space between you and everything that exists down below, something happens to thought. It becomes clearer, more patient, more honest. It was countless hours flying over China that taught me some of the most important things I know. The first is about scale and humility. When you see a city of 20 million people, that fits entirely within the field of view of a cockpit window. When you overfly mountains that have existed for tens of millions of years, when you realize that the path of an ant on a street in Shanghai is invisible from your altitude, but that ant, that human being, that nameless person, walking down that street has a complete life, a complete history, a complete interior cosmology. Something changes in the way you see yourself in the world. I started flying at 22. I was young and full of certainties. Certainties about what the world should be, about how things should work, about what was important and what was not. 30 years of altitude cured me of almost all of those certainties. What took their place was something more useful: curiosity. The conviction that the world is larger, more complex, and more beautiful than any narrative we can build about it. China was my most consistent teacher in that, because China resists simplification. It doesn't fit in a slogan. It doesn't fit in an adjective. It is simultaneously the oldest of continuous civilizations and one of the countries that has reinvented itself most rapidly in modern history. It is simultaneously a one-party state with rigid controls and a society of such creativity and vitality that it leaves visitors astonished. It is simultaneously the land of millennial temples and the land of drones and artificial intelligence. I remember a late night, it was perhaps 3 a.m, local time, crossing the interior of the country on a route from Beijing to Singapore. The moon was full and low on the horizon, and its light bathed the plains below me in a silver white that turned everything into a painting. Fields, rivers, roads, all silver and shadow. The first officer was asleep in his seat on rest. The autopilot controlled the aircraft with a precision I could never have matched manually, and I sat there in a state that was neither quite wakefulness nor sleep, watching China in the moonlight, and thought, how many people have looked at this same moon from this same patch of earth? Over 5,000 years? How many poets? How many farmers? How many soldiers on the eve of battle? How many children who never knew that one day there would be men in flying machines, looking down at the same moon that lit up their backyard? Li Bai, the great poet of the Tang dynasty, wrote in the 8th century a poem about looking at the moon and feeling homesick. That poem, Quiet Night Thoughts, is the most memorized poem in the history of Chinese literature. More than 1,000 years later, I was there, in a machine leap I could never have imagined, looking at the same moon over the same land and feeling, with all the strangeness that implies, exactly what he described. The sky connects everything. That is what flying has taught me. The sky has no borders, no centuries, no passports. The sky is the same for everyone who has ever existed and for everyone who is yet to exist. And when you are up there, navigating through it, carrying hundreds of people on your back, with the responsibility of bringing them home safely, you feel that with an intensity that is hard to put into words. But I am trying. That is what Tales from the Sky is, the attempt to translate the untranslatable. The attempt to bring down to earth what can only be learned when you go up. Every journey has a descent. No matter how long the route, no matter how extraordinary what you saw up there, the moment always comes when the altitude indicator begins to fall, when you select the descent flight level on the FMS selector, when the engine reduces its thrust slightly and the nose of the aircraft points, very gently, downward. In those moments, there is a quiet melancholy that every pilot knows but rarely admits. It is the end of something that will never be repeated in exactly the same way. That flight, with those conditions, with those clouds in that particular shape, with that light at exactly to 23 p.m. above that valley in China, it existed once and only once. And it is over. In my final years of active service as a captain, before dedicating more time to projects like this one, trying to tell these stories to those who cannot be in the cockpit, I developed a ritual. Before beginning the descent, especially after long routes over territories that had moved me, I would take a moment, just one moment. I would look out at the horizon one last time, register what I was seeing, and say, mentally, thank you. I am not entirely sure to whom. Perhaps to the aircraft which had performed perfectly. Perhaps to the atmosphere which had held us up. Perhaps to China down below, which once again had been generous enough to let us pass. Perhaps simply to the universe, for the improbable sequence of events that makes it possible for there to be human beings capable of flying, capable of wonder, capable of feeling that a landscape is worth remembering. China gave me much. It gave me the humility of the Himalayas. It gave me the vertigo of Shanghai at dusk. It gave me the quiet emotion of watching the Great Wall serpentine through the mountains as though it were the dream of an architect who knew no limits. It gave me nights with a full moon over plains that have existed for millennia. It gave me the unsettling beauty of the cast towers of Guilin inside the clouds. It gave me the sound of the radio in Mandarin on the ATC frequencies, that language that sounds like music to those who do not speak it. It also gave me something that is harder to name, a sense that the human world, for all its chaos, for all its violence, for all its waste and occasional mediocrity, also has moments of genuine greatness. Moments when you look at what we have been capable of building, not just the cities and the walls and the airports, but the civilizations, the languages, the philosophies, the ways of understanding the world, and you feel something that can only be described as pride in being human. China gave me those moments more than any other place I have ever flown over, and that list is long. Today, when I look at a globe and run my finger across the Chinese territory, I do not see a map. I see each one of those flights. I see the snow of a Beijing winter. I see the Li River reflecting the rain. I see the lights of Chongqing climbing the hillsides. I see the moon over the plains of the interior. I see the Great Wall as a line written on the earth by the hand of history. And I feel, as I have always felt when I look down from the cockpit, immensely small, and immensely grateful for that. This was Tales from the Sky. I am your captain, and as I always say when the plane lands, thank you for flying with us. Until the next flight.